Davis and whoever, they were going to break these plantations up into 40-acre lots, right, like a farm. And then what they were going to do is give it all the freedmen the titular 40 acres and a mule, right? And so there's a few things we can mention about that. Why would the freedmen want this? Well, there was this argument about like, hey, we worked for these guys our whole lives. We never got paid anything. You know, we never were able to earn a living. We don't have the means to sort of be self-sufficient and earn a living. This would allow the freedmen to do that, right? This would give us that independence. There was also this argument about sort of fairness, right? Shouldn't the Confederates be punished? I mean, they're traitors, they own slaves, they treated us badly. Shouldn't we get paid for our work? There was also this really important argument that we basically discussed when we talked about things like sharecropping and tenancy, where the freedmen understood that if you freed them, but then made them go back to their former owners for jobs, it was probably not going to go well for them, right? It was probably not going to be employment on fair terms. And so what was the only way you could sort of be totally outside of that exploitative system? Well, if you owned a farm and it belonged to you and you had the title to it, then at least you could grow food and sell the extra, right? At least you could produce food to eat and you could sell the extra and make cash. And the 40 acres and a mule would obviously let you do that, right? You would be able to say, you know, no, I don't want to go become a sharecropper. I have this farm that I own, right? It belongs to me. And so understandably, the freedmen figured, absent this kind of distribution program, they probably weren't going to be able to get anything like that on their own, right? That was probably not going to be forthcoming on their own. Now, of course, this runs into, it's a perfect example of the kind of irresistible force, immovable object kind of paradox of Reconstruction, right? On the one hand, from a sort of a free the slaves, kind of help out the freedmen perspective, this makes perfect sense, right? I mean, there's nobody that ever deserved to have their property taken away more than Confederates who attacked the government, owned slaves, and all that kind of stuff, especially if you're a guy like Charles Sumner. On the other hand, if from a reconciliation perspective of like we're trying to bring the country together again and sort of move on past the Civil War and get over these divides that we've had between the North and the South since the 1700s, that's the exact opposite of what you would want, right? Taking the Confederates' property away would be guaranteed to enrage them at the very least and presumably make them much more sympathetic to Confederacy round two kind of thinking, much less likely to be sort of okay with the settlement. And of course, there's also a really good argument of, can the government take this property away legally? Can you go just appropriate property owned by Confederates? You can't, right? That's under the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment. It allows you to not be safe and secure in your person. You cannot have your property taken away except by due process of law. And so did the Confederates break any laws? Well, we never really bothered to nail that down in the interest of sort of settling this whole issue, right? If you want to define support for the Confederacy as a crime, the government could do that and then could take this land away, but then you're just turning potentially millions of people into criminals, right? Is the government going to go arrest everyone who served in the Confederate military? Are they going to go arrest everybody who voted for secession? That's a very big can of worms, right? And so the government did do a little bit of this early on in the Civil War, 1863, 64, 65. There was a Davis Bend, Jefferson Davis's plantation in Mississippi was expropriated and broken up into farms. On the Carolina coast, General Sherman broke up plantations and issued them to freedmen, who he then put to work growing food, and he bought it from them, paid them, and they had to pay mortgages for their farms. But they liked that, the idea that if you paid something, you get it, right? That you sort of own it. And so for a while it worked, but as you might not be surprised to know, the former Confederates, they sued in federal court, right? I mean, they went to court and they said, you can't do this to us, right? And it's your Jefferson Davis, who was the least sympathetic person imaginable, he's got a point, right? If you take all my slaves and you declare them to be not slaves of their people and I can't own them, I can't argue with that's in the Constitution, but is owning land illegal? Can the government simply come in and seize my property, my land, and divide it up? No, right? There's no legal basis for doing that. And so that, as you might imagine, put the supporters of this kind of a policy and the freedmen in a very awkward position. You could have done something like this. You could have passed a federal law. You could have amended the Constitution. This could have been in the 14th Amendment. The Confederates have to sacrifice a third of their property to the federal government. But that would have made it a very difficult thing to pass, right? It would have been a very difficult thing to stomach. And so ultimately, where you end up with is a terrible situation where to do something like this, which for many freedmen they consider to be the sort of fundamental necessity of making them actually free, you run headlong into that making the reconciliation part of Reconstruction essentially impossible, right? If you're going to make Southerners pay the kind of financial burden that you would need to make that right, well, then you're just going to have no reconciliation at all, right? And so, as you might imagine, 40 acres and a mule thus becomes this sort of slogan, this kind of story, this sort of myth. It's never happens, right? There's no organized program to do this. It never really occurs, and that's sort of that. It's sort of just a mirage, right? But as we discussed towards the end of Reconstruction, how you have these sort of mutually exclusive ideas about what Reconstruction should really be about, 40 acres and a mule is a really, really good way to figure that out, right? To do what the freedmen thought they wanted and what people argued was a necessity for them, right? It was only fair for people who had never had any opportunity to gain wealth in their lives. To do that meant that getting the allegiance of Southerners again would probably not be possible. And so it just doesn't happen, right? And of course, as you might imagine, during the second part of Grant's term, something like that is completely off the table, right? The government is only barely doing Reconstruction as much as it is in the face of this backlash from Southern conservatives, the KKK, and so on. And so that just sort of goes away, right? And as you might imagine, later on, when you look at the South and you see things like sharecropping and segregation, 40 acres and a mule becomes this sort of wonderful missed opportunity, right? If we had done something like that, then millions of African Americans wouldn't have been stuck as sharecroppers, but unfortunately that just wasn't going to work, right? So indeed, we talked a lot of that was a repeat, but specifically 40 acres and a mule I don't think I brought out before, so there it is, right? And when you see that on the test, that's exactly what that phrase means, right? So now let's go back to where we were talking about Native Americans and the Indian Wars. So again, the point I think we were making last time is that when the Civil War ends, attention goes back to the frontier, right? There had obviously not been very much Western settlement like you're seeing in this picture during the Civil War. Everybody's fighting the war. And of course, the various Indian tribes in the frontier used that opportunity to attack the settlers. We were the Comanche in West Texas, the Apache a little further southwest, the various Indian tribes that had been deported to Oklahoma in the 1830s, the Cherokee among others. They ironically aligned themselves with the Confederate governments. They're not particularly interested in secession or slavery, although the Cherokee in fact did own slaves, which was the dispute around a Supreme Court case last year, I think. Regarding the rights of people who'd been held as slaves by the Cherokee or their descendants. But the Cherokee in particular hated the federal government, right? They hated the American government. And so their argument was very simple. If you people in gray hate the American government, want to kill them, like we're fine with that, we would help you too, right? And of course the irony or the sort of tragedy here is that when the Civil War ended, the American federal government used the support that those Indian tribes had given the Confederacy as a means of legal justice or a legal basis to deprive them of more rights. They sort of punished those Indian tribes quite harshly. And of course, they supported the Confederacy, right? We went to war and they sided with the bad guy. Well, of course they did because they had these incredibly strong grievances against you going back, a generation or so. But as we, I think, put it, when you get down to it, there's this idea that most Americans have about the West, that this sort of this grand arena where we're going to bring civilization to the wilderness, and we're going to sort of fill in the blank space on the map and exploit all these vast resources. And the Indians just don't really feature in it. They're just not. They're just an obstacle that you have to get out of the way, right? They're just a thing. They're just the sort of the savages that have to be cleared away so that we can do what we need to do. And at the very minimum, or the very maximum, you might even say, there's this idea that I guess we could tolerate the Indians if they would just like go onto a reservation and just get out of the way, right? And like obviously adopt their sort of settled ways and all that kind of stuff, right? And so quite quickly, as we discussed, diplomacy falls apart and you end up with military action, right? And as you might imagine, when you get a guy like Sheridan or Sherman involved, they're very clear about what they assume that they're being asked to do, which is just kill Indians until they go away, right? Until they're willing to accept the deal the government's offering them. The problem with the Indians that you have too stems from the bison. This is the American bison. The Indians on the plains that you're talking about during the 1860s and 70s and 80s particularly are dependent on the bison. They have this very, very evolved, very specific culture designed around exploiting the basically largest natural resource of the plains, the herds of bison, right? So Indians to the further east and the further west are a little different. But the Indians on the Great Plains primarily were nomadic. That is to say, they had no fixed settlements or abodes. They didn't build towns and cities. They traveled around in groups. They carried everything that they had. It was all portable, right? They had teepees they could fold up, made of buffalo hide. They had limited possessions they could bundle up in the teepee and put on the back of a horse. prior to Columbus in the 1490s, of course, these Indians actually traveled on foot. The teepee was smaller and was carried on somebody's back, right? Horses not being native to the Western Hemisphere. All the Plains Indians hunted buffalo on foot up until probably the 1520s or 30s. When Spain released large horse herds in central Mexico. The Indians started poaching horses and learning how to ride. And so we think of cowboys and Indians, and you think of the Indians riding around on horseback. That could only have happened after the European contact with the New World. There weren't horses. The horses died out in the New World around the last ice age when they were very small. And we have fossil horses, but they didn't get big enough to where humans began to tame them and domesticate them before they died out. And so the Plains Indians thus sort of had this very rarefied, very sort of odd life that depends on the buffalo. They follow these vast buffalo herds around, and people didn't quite believe how many buffalo there really were on the Great Plains. Hernando de Soto in the 1500s explored the Mississippi River basin, and they traveled up the Mississippi River, and he reported these just enormous, sort of stupefying herds of bison, and people didn't quite believe him. I mean, there hadn't been herds of animals like that in Europe since 10,000 BC, right, when Stone Age hunters killed everything. And yet, there they were, right? And so the Indians hunted the buffalo, they skinned them, they made things out of the skin, they ate the meat, they boiled the hooves, they used the bones, the sinews, the guts, they used every part of the buffalo that they could think of a way to use. And so they were quite good at it. And so, as you might imagine, these things put them in direct conflict with the settlers and the government, right? The settlers want to clear out the buffalo herds, they view them as a nuisance. They want to throw up fences, and they want to ranch cows. They want to plant crops, which the buffalo would tear up or eat. They want to dig wells and build homes, and they don't want the Indians traveling around. The very concept, of course, of subdividing land into little parcels that people own doesn't really sort of an anathema to the way that the Indians work, right? I mean, they have this idea that they want to go wherever the buffalo go, and that's just what they do, right? In the spring and summer and fall, they follow the buffalo around. They land in stock of meat. In the winter time, they hole up someplace with fresh water, eat the meat until the snow breaks, and they go find the buffalo, and off they go again. And so, putting a fence around a place and telling the Indians you can't come here doesn't really, that's not the way that they see things, right? And so, having said that, the government decides on a very effective strategy to deal with this. They decide that the best way to go after the Indians is to eliminate their primary food supply and resource, and that is to kill buffalo. So what the government does for a couple of decades is pay cash for buffalo skin. And so as a result, you get millions of people who flood into the Great Plains. And of course, it's a pretty reliable way to make money. You just go find buffalo, shoot them, skin them, and bring the government the skins, the buffalo hides, right? You can't kill buffalo with a pistol. You need a high caliber rifle. They call them a buffalo gun for a reason. It's usually a high caliber breech loading rifle. So you get your breech loading rifle, your buffalo gun, you get a box of shells. If you go close to a buffalo and shoot it, you'll kill it, but all of the other buffalo will stampede because they're dumb, but they're not that dumb. So what you can do to really get the buffalo is if you go somewhere where they can't really see you easily, like you lie down on the top of a hill, and then you kill them with the buffalo gun, they will notice the sound, but they won't really understand what's happening, and so they won't do anything. And so you can shoot 10, 20, 30 buffalo with a buffalo gun, and then walk down, scare them away with a pistol or something, and then skin the ones that you killed. Which is, of course, as you might imagine, quite dirty, quite gruesome to do. Then when you're done, you don't really need the rest of the buffalo. Nobody's paying for that. You just take the skins, throw them on a wagon, cook the meat, maybe whatever you want for dinner, eat right there, and then just leave. Right? And of course, cumulatively over the course of the 1870s and 80s, this has the effect of making it increasingly difficult for the Plains Indians to survive. Their primary food source is simply being hunted to extinction. Right? And so there are endless stories about people on trains having to stop the train because of the herds of buffalo on the tracks, so they kill them to clear the tracks. There are stories about herds of buffalo walking past trains and people just leaning out of the train, shooting them for sport, for fun. And of course, everybody knows places where you can go and find where herds of buffalo have been killed. There's these endless plains full of buffalo bones, as far as the eye can see, that have been hunting grounds. To be fair, the Indians used to do that as well. They used to drive herds of buffalo off the cliffs, kill them all in the fall, and then go skin them and get them at the bottom of the cliff. And so by the 1880s, as you might imagine, for groups of Indians like the Comanche, like the Apache, and like the Sioux Indians, it's really hard to survive with your primary food source gone, right? And so that does exactly what the government had wanted it to do. It gives the Indians sort of less room to maneuver. Now when the government comes along and says, hey, do you want to go on a reservation? We'll give you subsidies. You can learn English, you can go to school, you can convert to the Christian religion.